Hello, everybody, and welcome to our podcast, Unpacking Organizations, where Rupert and I talk about our passion topics around org design, workforce planning, and everything under the sun.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.
And this season, we are very excited to have guests joining us on our podcast. So, Rupert, how are you today?
I'm great, thank you. All the better for having Alice join us. Alice, welcome.
Yes. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you. Great to be here with two people who I love to talk to. So,
Thank you. So, Alice and I have known each other for a little while now. But, Alice, I think before we jump into org design and all the stuff that we love about that and your work in particular in private equity, it'd be great just to hear a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and what you love to do outside of org design.
I live in New York and I've been here since 2004, but I'm originally from San Francisco. And where I actually first got started in organization transformation, I worked at a small boutique investment firm called Hambrecht and Quist that took dot-com companies public in the late 90s and then was bought by Chase. And so I was suddenly part of a very large company and went through about 5 years of mergers and acquisitions and large scale org transformation. And, in my work now, I interview a lot of executives and I always look for formative early career experiences. And so mine was really working with large companies in um, change and transformation and operating model type of work. And that has carried me into working with middle market private equity firms, very small and mid-sized companies, but with complicated stakeholder dynamics.
Very cool, Alice. I didn't know that tidbit, so thank you for sharing.
Mhm.
And now you are a founder of a boutique consulting firm yourself. And so that's why we have been talking and conversing about what led to that, Alice. Like, what led to now focusing specifically on PE firms and starting an organization on your own now?
I'm an entrepreneur myself, and even though I worked in large companies early in my career, I also early on, I met Amy Cates, who founded Cates Kessler, an org design boutique that was bought by Accenture in 2020. And I worked with her and others for about 10 years with as that firm grew. But it was always a boutique, and we worked with some of the biggest companies in the world, but with a really great method that was building capabilities within the organizations, teaching people how to fish, and then helping them understand the concepts and the methods that we were using. So always building the organizations and then helping them, consulting with them to do organization design. I was then recruited into private equity in 2018, and I worked in private equity in two different middle market firms as a human capital partner and operating partner. And I was struck right away. I was brought in, I think, because of my org design background, into a firm that did special situations, org transformation in these small to mid-sized companies. And so what struck me right away with kind of the organization lens that I bring is these are complex stakeholder dynamics. So organization design in a mid-sized company was complicated not by what should we do. Usually these were simple companies with a functional design and maybe you were adding a region or a product. But what was complicated was we've got these private equity investors and what's their role? We've got these operating partners, what's their role? What does management do? And so that got me really interested in kind of the private equity world. And then I did that in two different firms for about 5 years and then went back out on my own because of kind of all that I've learned combining human capital, private equity, and org design.
Fantastic.
Amazing. And having been in, big corporates, so with Cates Kessler and Chase, so you've got, huge enterprises, and then smaller founder-led. Let's start with what's similar, rather, because it's always interesting to go with what's different, and we'll get to that. But
Mhm.
what's similar? What's the same, if anything?
Between the founder-led and the large
Founder-led,
company?
smaller, PE-backed, and then these
Yeah,
massive enterprises.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think of the world of business, it started out, it was always founder-led, family-run companies, and so, so there's an evolution, I think, that you see, large corporations have developed often bigger systems, human capital approaches, have invested in a lot of things. But when it comes down to it, it's about aligning a whole bunch of people, against ways of working, against a set of goals and strategies. And so I think often private equity firms treat founder led companies as something special, something different, like almost like they can't handle kind of systems and processes and expectations and roles and goals. And I look at it differently than that. I think in my experience, and I've worked with a lot of founder led companies, everybody wants clarity, put things on the table, be treated like adults, have a conversation. And so I think, often it's the same set of conversations really between private equity boards and founders that need to happen, as in a public board meeting. What's the strategy? What are the goals? What are we expecting of people? What are the roles to do that?
And do you think the strategy is clearer in a PE-backed business because they have value creation plans and they have more of a fixed time horizon? Or is it just as unclear as with most enterprises?
This is a great topic, Rupert. I know we've talked about this. I have worked with a lot of private equity firms on the value creation plan. So my approach to human capital is it's a system that starts with a strategy. And if as soon as human capital conversations happen outside of the conversation about the strategy, you're in a silo and you're not connected to where the business is going and how it's making money. And it's similar in private equity. I think many conversations get siloed: human capital, organization design, operations, but really the first conversation that I try to have, even in diligence, is what is the strategy? Are we aligned on how we're going to grow this company? What's unique in private equity is obviously you have a shorter time horizon, but also you have accelerated expectations, right? So you have, we're going to triple in size, we're going to grow volume even faster, we're going to, increase margins and do it in 5 years. And I look at that as a major change event, right? It's like as soon as that transaction has happened, you're putting management under this new set of expectations. So, perfect opportunity to sit down and say, what is our value creation plan? Now, I've worked with many different firms on what that looks like. I think that, the bigger the firm, the longer they've done this, hopefully the better at the value creation planning they've gotten. But a lot of times it's really left pretty ambiguous. It's a conversation, it's a series of conversations. It's not a strategy in the way that we might think of strategy. And so that's actually the place that I start with a lot of private equity firms, is that value creation capability.
And how difficult is usually to get to that point, to even get to them, to for them to understand that this is important? Because most often what I've also seen is that you're gotten in to get human capital work, and then when you start talking about what is your strategy and what is your value creation, it's a very different conversation, and they get really, I think, taken aback sometime that, why are you asking me this? Is
Yeah.
that common, Alice?
It is, and I think, that might answer the question of like what's common across the large companies and the
Mm.
small companies and private and public. When I worked with Cates Kessler, it was this first conversation we had there was, what's the strategy? How do we align the organization design with the strategy? And often it was, well, let's define that. Let's articulate that. Let's
Right.
put that down on paper. Oh, okay, we have some gaps. So it's similar, in that regard.
And given that PE firms are investing in multiple portfolio companies, every year there's a number of investments they make. How mature is their practice at thinking about org design? And given that you've seen quite a few different PE firms, how does
Mhm.
that vary?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think some of the bigger firms are starting to think, and part of this is the market, the performance across the portfolio isn't as strong in a lot of cases. And so, okay, so they're starting to think across the portfolio, what can we do? What capabilities can we bring? And there are some that are starting to ask the question of like, could that be organization design? Could it be org transformation? Is that a capability we should be looking at across the portfolio? But most of the time, it's brought up when there's an acquisition of equals. We need to look at the organization design of two companies, and there's a reason to bring them together and think about and invest in that. Sometimes it's with larger portfolio companies where there's performance issues or there just is a change in strategy. I think the middle market private equity firms think about it episodically, mainly when there's an integration. But the other opportunity that I've seen is looking at the organization, the operating model of the firm itself. And I'm happy to talk about that too, because that's sure. Yeah. So a lot of middle market firms have evolved. They've been around for a couple of decades usually, so they're still pretty small themselves, but they're managing with billions of dollars in assets in portfolios of companies with thousands of employees. They themselves are usually pretty small and have evolved organically. Often the investment team started with a band of generalists, right? Like they did everything. The founder and the investment leads did back office, they sourced deals, they did fundraising, and then they managed the companies through the whole life cycle to sell. Over time they had to bring in specialists to do fundraising, to do business development, and then operating partners, seasoned executives to kind of sit side by side with the investment team and develop value creation capabilities, and then human capital people. But you still see a kind of a generalist mindset where the deal team is focused kind of vertically on how do we drive value in our companies that we're focused on. And then you bring in these operating partners, value creation, human capital people, and they're focused on the capabilities across the portfolio. And so I think of that as like your classic org design tension between like, you've got your kind of shared services or your value creation. And then you've got, all of these, deal teams focused on driving performance in one or two or three companies. And so that's where the conversation starts around the operating model. But then it's evolved with, investment firms that I've worked with around what is the governance model? Like, what is the role of a board member, an investment team member? Sometimes that's the same person, a management team member, an operating partner, a value creation leader in driving value. And you think about like roles, each of us should have some sort of distinct, role in driving value. However, those are often very blended. And so the ambiguity, I think, with some firms, portfolios, needing to improve the performance, they're looking at, okay, well, we've got 5 different roles, but they're all kind of doing the same thing, or it's not clear what each of us is contributing. So then that, sparks a conversation about what is our operating model? Like what are horizontal capabilities, value creation, human capital, org design that we run across the portfolio? And then what are the things we do specifically with each company?
Yeah.
So that's been a really interesting conversation with a number of investment firm clients.
What I've seen a little bit is some larger PE firms, they'll have a value creation team, value enhancement group. which will be functional experts. You might have someone on pricing or marketing, sales is very common, finance, functional knowledge. Sometimes I'll have an HR person. But what I observe more frequently is they are really around the talent side and how do we make the executive team as strong as possible. And it's, I would say, relatively, at least in my experience, what I'm observing, but you have more experience than I do in this, very few actually see org design as a functional capability. And imagine, you're managing, some firms are quite large and they'll have 60 to 100 portfolio companies and, billions and billions AUM. And, their portfolio companies are growing significantly and going through many of the crises that, say the Grainer curve. So, which are inflection points where you need to think about your organization design because it won't be fit for purpose. Yet those muscles aren't developed in the PE firm, and equally, by definition, the portfolio companies don't have that either because they're quite small and they don't have the budgets to afford an OP&A capability or an org design team. So in my mind, it's a big mess. And I guess that's partly where you're seeing traction, that people are recognizing that. But I'd love to know your kind of perspective on that.
Well, there's such an obvious opportunity with, even if you just think about it financially, right? Which is, where a lot of private equity firms are coming from. If you think about it financially, half of your operating expenses on average are spent on people. And, how well are they aligned against performance and against productivity drivers or value creation drivers? That's where, org design or even a more granular function can come in to really align and look, using systems and data and an organization design process to align people against those drivers. But it's interesting. It does take time and it is an investment up front. And I think sometimes that one, kind of not understanding what that function does, what that expertise does, and how you do it. And then, the investment of people's time to do it, the systems and processes to do it.
So we like to ask two questions. One tool, one practical thing that our listeners can take away that they can apply, and one trap. So starting with the tool, what tool have you used, particularly in the context of PE, that you find useful, that you think our listeners would also find useful?
Yeah. Well, it's a concept which is, I think, a lot about people plus context equals performance, people plus situation equals performance. And so often when you look at a people or individual or a team's performance, you can understand it much better if you look at the context. And so my questions are always about what is the context? What are the roles? What are the expectations? What are the incentives? What is driving the behavior? Instead of looking at those individuals in terms of personality or talent only. And so that helps me diagnose, it helps me understand, but it's a lot easier for a private equity firm to control the context than the people. And because they're part of the context, it's also even easier. It's a huge opportunity to say, okay, we're the board, we're the owner, we're the operating partner. What can we control to help enable success? Or how can we understand the context that's driving the performance, whether it's up or down? And so that's a concept that I use. In terms of a trap, I think the trap is often to look at individuals out of context. So to say, how good is this CEO? How good is this person, at their job, without looking at the context of the team or the incentives or the environment or the organization design that they're part of. And often, one example is you say, well, if we had a great CEO, he would run a great strategy planning process. Okay, so that's one company, though. You have to put an individual in to run a strategy. But what about the capability that the whole firm could have in running a strategy planning process? You can invest in that capability for the firm instead of just hoping you're going to get the right individual in every company who can do that.
Nice.
Very cool. I like that. And I think it's the whole point around the systems thinking that Rupert and I always try to talk about, that think about the entire system, and people and talent is just one part of it, but what else is out there? So thank you for bringing that up, Alice.
Mhm. Great to
Rupert, do you
hear.
have any specific takeaways from our conversations today?
I think it's probably one is it's probably in a way more the same. Like there are different challenges in the sense of ownership and what have you, but I think the tools, the thinking, the rigor that's applied
Yeah.
in a large enterprise can be and should be applied to to PE-backed firms, and it's a mess for PE firms, not to develop this capability or have an understanding. And to develop the capability could be building an in-house team, but not everyone has the scale to do that. Or, a plug for you, Alice, but to bring in an
Mhm.
Alice, and Mann Partners. And actually, just as we wrap up, Alice, just how do people get hold of you if they want to reach out?
Yeah, so they can find me at my email, alice@mannpartnersinc.com. My website, same domain, and or LinkedIn, just by my name.
Great. Thank you, Alice.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Thank you
thank you
so
for having
much
me.
for being our guest, Alice. Truly
Yeah,
a
my
pleasure.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And thank you, Rupert. Until next time,
Until next time. Thanks. Bye.
take care. Bye
bye
now.
bye.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.